Well, thanks again, for joining us. The topic tonight is the new McCarthyism and what we can do to fight back against it. This topic is significant to society today and to many people, including me personally, as I have often experienced it working in higher education as well as alternative media. The term McCarthyism is associated with such negative human behavior traits as bullying and anti-intellectualism, a herd mentality, a lack of empathy for other people, a lack of critical thinking, and with political authoritarianism that I think is growing in both Canada and the United States and is antithetical to the founding ideals of both of these countries. I am reminded of the story of a woman from California who was in sixth grade when the Korean War broke out in 1950, and she told her teacher that she thought the US should not get involved in the Korean conflict. The teacher responded before the whole class, "That's the commie position." And all the class started laughing at her, and the poor kid started crying and went home crying that day. And I have to ask people in the audience, are the adults today any better than the teacher and the kids in this poor girl's class? And unfortunately, it's not much, maturity level is not much higher. And it should be noted in the 7 years hindsight that that girl was right. If the US had stayed out of the Korean War, the peninsula would be united and not divided today like it is tragically, and millions of lives would have been saved. The term McCarthyism, specifically derives from the anti-communist witch hunt in the 1950s of Senator Joseph McCarthy, a Republican from Wisconsin, who catapulted himself to national prominence after giving a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, claiming without evidence that there were 205 card-carrying members of the Communist Party working in the United States State Department. The kinds of people who supported McCarthy's witch hunt may have been similar to the people in Puritan New England who supported the execution of young girls in Salem, Massachusetts, who supposedly subscribed to witchcraft, and the same kind of people who burned down the home of Thomas Morton, a New Englander who empathized with the Native Americans and thought the Puritans could learn to live in harmony with them and learn from their way of life instead of stealing their land and massacring them. The anti-communist fervor that swept the US in the 50s was very self-destructive. It transcended the political career of Joseph McCarthy, and it was supported and driven by many liberal politicians of that era, like Harry Truman, Lyndon Johnson, and Hubert Humphrey, the latter of whom led the purge of leftists in Minnesota's farmer labor and Democratic parties. The consequences of McCarthyism in the 1950s and 60s was to destroy many careers and lives, to decimate the American left, with serious ramifications today as the country slides ever further and further to the right without a significant left-wing movement, and to create a poisonous political atmosphere at that time that fueled disastrous and one could argue quasi-genocidal US wars in Korea as well as Vietnam. Many studies have detailed how Senator McCarthy and others like him were supported by wealthy business interests who saw the Red Scare an opportunity to help roll back the New Deal reforms benefiting the working class by equating left-wing views with communism. One of the first victims of McCarthyism was Henry Wallace, Franklin D. Roosevelt's vice president, who ran as an independent in the 1948 election on a platform of peace with Russia, abolishing nuclear weapons, and closing down U.S. military bases abroad. Other victims included members of the Foreign Service who questioned U.S. military aid to Chiang Kai-shek, a corrupt Chinese warlord who was defeated by the Maoists in China's civil war. And this triggered a hysteria about who lost China. Today, under the new McCarthyism, Russia and China are again the enemy, and any person who wants a cooperative policy or questions U.S. provocation towards those countries are attacked as Putin apologists and other such kind of terms. They're slandered. People are again losing their jobs. Academics and journalists are again feeling intimidated. Diplomats again feel they must support these aggressive foreign policies or else lose their jobs. And political figures who promote peace, like Henry Wallace, are again being attacked viciously and smeared in the mainstream, often again by liberal Democrats, who are again playing a key role in this toxic political atmosphere. The vehemence of the attacks today appears to reflect the desperation of a ruling elite that is losing its grip as the world moves towards multipolarity. Often now, critics of existing policies are maligned as conspiracy theorists, a CIA term first used to discredit people who challenged the false conclusions of the Warren Commission report that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin of JFK. As well as now, they call them far-right extremists, when often they're not. Often in the past, they called them far-left extremists. Today, the left is more weak, and we find politicians on the right now often opposing wars like Ukraine, or questioning the CIA because they believe the CIA was after Donald Trump. So now anyone who questions the CIA, even if they're not part of the right, are attacked as right-wingers or far-right extremists. Tulsi Gabbard and Robert F. Kennedy come to mind as kind of heirs of Henry Wallace type politics. In my view, the best kinds of people to come out of our system who advocate for peace, and they've both been mercilessly pilloried and effectively purged from the Democratic Party, which both had to leave. In Kennedy's case, he has been attacked, and one could debate his views on certain issues, but in general, he does advocate for policies of peace, like Henry Wallace with Russia. He has been attacked, for favoring peace with Ukraine and China, also because he wants to reopen investigation into the murder of his father and uncle, and he had the gall to challenge the dominant COVID-19 narrative and corruption in the medical, pharmaceutical, industrial complex and CIA, which many believe may have bioengineered the coronavirus. So now a new smear term, the new McCarthyism, is applied to him and his supporters, anti-vaxxers. This, when Kennedy has made clear he is not against vaccines, only hastily manufactured ones that he believes are unsafe for the public. And again, these smears and bile directed against Kennedy, it's not an objective. You could debate points he makes, but what we see is just a constant barrage of attacks and smears directed at him in the media, and often from people on the left of the political spectrum, who some call the lockdown left, which advocates for censorship and blacklisting, purges of people who don't share their support for certain measures. Russiagate is another twist, pointing to the vital role of liberals in the new McCarthyism, and that a conservative Republican president, mentored ironically by Joseph McCarthy's lawyer, Roy Cohn, and a McCarthy-type bully in his own way, but he's smeared as well as being a Russian agent. And this is a baseless charge. It was disproven in the Mueller and Durham reports. No evidence has ever emerged of his alleged collaboration with the Russians, but the media attacked him for years. The liberal media, CNN, MSNBC, New York Times, Washington Post, of being a Russian agent and puppet of Russian President Vladimir Putin. The Russiagate hoax helped fuel a poisonous atmosphere of the new McCarthyism, which has been used to mobilize public opinion in support of a failing and entirely avoidable proxy war with Russia in Ukraine that has seen a return to the brutal trench warfare of World War I and resulted in the decimation of a generation of Ukrainian and Russian youth. While Russiagate was unfolding, politicians began deliberately stoking xenophobia to give rationalization behind the U.S. military buildup in Southeast Asia and incitement of Taiwan separatism that could lead to a major war with China. Donald Trump set the pattern when he called the coronavirus Kung Flu. In Oklahoma, where I live, the Education Secretary, Ryan Walters, recently accused the Tulsa School Board of having been infiltrated by the Chinese Communist Party because one of its Chinese language teachers obtained a grant to go to a conference run by a Confucius Institute in Dallas. Senator Marco Rubio, Republican of Florida, has called for investigation of what he calls far-left organizations, and I think he's picked specifically on Code Pink, the peace group, for allegedly violating the Foreign Agents Registration Act because of alleging funding ties to China. Under the China Initiative, Chinese scientists were falsely accused of being spies and fired, deported, or arrested, and a distinguished Harvard professor was jailed because he didn't properly report some grant money that he obtained from the Chinese government. Tonight we have so this gives a basic overview of the climate I think we're experiencing and how it ties to earlier period of McCarthyism. Tonight we have some distinguished guests who have direct experience with this new McCarthyism, both in the United States and Canada. One, Jody Evans, is the co-founder of Code Pink, an amazing peace group which has used creative means to protest illegal wars waged by the United States and has often traveled around the world to display compassion for victims of those wars and solidarity with them. And they've been attacked, including hit pieces in the New York Times, and maybe a target of Rubio's McCarthyite efforts. Another speaker we have, Ben Norton, will paint more political analysis and context. He had dissected U.S. war propaganda in his writings and exposed this new McCarthyism. The last two speakers are from Canada, which is experiencing the same kind of political atmosphere as the United States. And Canada, it should be noted, had a repressive climate as well during the original Cold War, and history is repeating itself badly. Although, and I think things are worse, Justin Trudeau, the current prime minister, from my understanding, his father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, adopted a more independent course for Canada, including in the realm of its political economy and foreign policy. But Justin Trudeau has basically kowtowed to U.S. interests and followed his conservative predecessor, Stephen Harper, completely aligning Canada with U.S. empire, funding the war in Ukraine, and supporting the U.S. military buildup in Southeast Asia and more provocations with China over Taiwan. The Chinagate scandal has been reported quite extensively in the Canada files and can be compared with the Russiagate scandal or hoax in the United States. And we'll hear more about that from our speakers. From the articles I read in the Canada files, they reported on the RCMP, or Canadian Police, investigation into police stations in Quebec. They tried to claim were operated by the Chinese Communist Party, which they said were used to manipulate municipal politics. They also RCMP also accused Chinese-run organizations that serve the Chinese community in Quebec of being part of some kind of nefarious spy plot, had their funding cut off. Chinese Confucius Institutes have had their funding cut off also. China has been basically accused of trying to interfere in Canadian politics, just like Russia has been basically accused in interfering in U.S. politics. And Ottawa announced a ban on research with individuals connected to the Chinese military. And this has all fueled this xenophobia and a toxic political climate. And so our two Canadian speakers, one, Eleanor Wong, is a writer who was subjected to political persecution in Canada and exiled after writing 3 books critical of Justin Trudeau and after exposing U.S.-Canadian incitement of the 2019-2020 anti-Chinese Hong Kong protests. And another speaker we have, Dr. Wenran Jiang, is a political activist, author, and advisor at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, which seems to be a rarity these days, and that is a pro-peace think tank. And before I turn it over, I just want to say that one question we can address in both the talks and discussion at the end is how we can fight back against this climate of repression unfolding around us. And in the 1960s, the repressive climate of McCarthyism from the 50s gave way to the liberal countercultural movement of young people that repudiated the backward worldview of their parents. And many of us here would hope that something will occur similarly, an awakening of our youth and something reminiscent of the 60s countercultural movement. And we have to hope those youth get off their TikTok that seems to consume all their time, and they can't, read books or think critically about what's going on around them. But as things get worse, we really have to place hope in our youth for a change, just like in the 1960s era. So I'll turn it over to Jody Evans. We'll talk a bit about Code Pink and her experience as a peace activist in this kind of climate. And then we'll move on to other speakers, and hopefully we'll have a good discussion at the end.
Thanks, Jeremy. I just want to say I am in the streets often with a lot of youth, and I'm super impressed with their brilliance, their fierceness, and their capacities. So I have a lot of faith in the youth. They give me hope. So thank you for inviting me to join this beautiful group of humans. Discuss one of the forms of violence the war machine uses to continue its bullying across the planet, affecting all life, including the life of the planet itself. So I want to start with the grief that I've been carrying for the last few days, because I can't talk if I don't bring it up. You know, the grief of lives lost, but the grief of the violence that continues in the conversation about what is happening right now. And it really ties into what we're talking about. That here we've looked at decades with the lives of Palestinians being held in silence with no acknowledgement for them. And we're watching it, you know, again here, like with Ukraine, the war machine distorting hearts and minds as the media continues to be a tool of the colonizers and the oppressors, totally remaking the world we live in into a narrative that has no resemblance to truth. I just flew from LA to San Francisco, and so watched CNN on the plane, and my brain literally wanted to explode. And so what we're watching right now is that use of the media to weaponize hearts and minds, to use the oppressed in the service of the oppressor. And I've seen that, you know, my whole adult life, watching the war in Vietnam, seeing my friends, siblings home in body bags and walking across the DMZ to learn of the lies about Korea, and how it was driven by hate and the manufacturing of an enemy. How communism is used as the enemy, the boogeyman, throughout, you know, this last century and again now, and this manufacturing of an enemy, the lies and the distortion that drove us to the war in Iraq, the violent response to 9/11, also based on lies and a refusal to take the necessary steps for peace, you know, like with Iraq, Ukraine, and Palestine. So I launched the China is Not Our Enemy campaign about 3.5 years ago, because I saw the exact same thing. I saw the distortion. I saw the propaganda. It was the same pattern. And I was just like, oh my God, is the United States going to go to war on China? That seems, you know, crazy. But I'm going to start talking about China's not our enemy as a preemptive step. When I see smoke, I don't want it to be a fire. And pulling together people across the world to talk about China is not our enemy. Learning very early, some weeds had been planted that, you know, if I got in them, they would try to consume me. So it's staying away from the weeds and just talking about China itself and what happens when the United States makes enemies of countries and what the price of that is. Who lies, who pays, who dies, and who profits. So in the process of, you know, having the actions every 2 weeks on China's not our enemy, hoping to educate especially the progressive movement about China, because it was very clear that they were trying to use the progressive movement as like the vanguard for this war on China with human rights and fights for democracy, et cetera, and protecting sovereign parts of, you know, protecting sovereignty, like all these things that would pull in the progressive movement, trying to educate people out of being, you know, weaponized by their beliefs. So we disrupted the first congressional committee hearing on that was done on primetime television. It was like the first time, at least that I could remember, a congressional committee just starting out would be their first meeting in prime time. I call it the Hate on China Committee. And we just disrupted it with a message: China is not our enemy. not long after that, I got a series of accusations from the New York Times demanding a response from me. And I don't read the New York Times. I don't respect the New York Times. 6 million people are dead in the Middle East because of the New York Times. So I didn't pay attention to it. I was like, what do I care? They're just going to lie, and I'm not going to respond. But this went on for 2 months. 11 journalists. I think we heard from close to 100 people that also received questions. And then we read in the paper, the New York Times, front page on a Saturday, a packet of lies and a hate mongering attack on myself, my husband, Tricontinental, the People's Forum, insinuating that everyone was marching, it had been funded by the Chinese government and were working for them, which is like, first of all, just outrageous on every level, besides being sexist and racist, and that VJ or myself haven't been doing this for me 50 years, him 40 years. Clearly, anyone who knows me knows I don't listen to anyone, including my husband. But besides that, I'm also have worked very hard in my life to be independent, so that I could operate very independent from a government and from any funding. So at Code Pink, I've never taken any money, a salary, expenses. I've never even personally taken any money from my husband, who has been supporting Code Pink before we were together. I think, what's beautiful is we met through the Tribunal on Palestine in England. So that it was his appreciation of the work of Code Pink and his appreciation of the work of VJ that has him supporting Code Pink, VJ, and the People's Forum. But, as I came back from China, my last trip, and I immediately went to Congress to speak with the 30 members of that committee to tell them what I had seen and to talk about the distortions they were operating out of. The hate continued and layered on. And but what I discovered that week in Congress was members of Congress telling me that they could not talk about peace. They couldn't talk about diplomacy. And one said, basically, if you talk about peace, you are buzzsawed. And just recently, in this last week, when I got arrested at Bernie's office for reminding him that he had said we need diplomacy, again, members of Congress were telling us that you can't even say China. They won't let China out of their mouth because they get crushed. So the McCarthyism is working. And as I pointed out to a member of Congress who said, oh, this hate on China committee, don't worry, it's nothing, that Jerry Brown had started a school at Berkeley, University of Berkeley, and University of California at Berkeley, and it was called the China-U.S. Cooperation School for the Planet. And they had closed down because of the congressional committee. So because of how dangerous it is been made to talk about China, they literally just closed down, which is why I started the China is not our enemy campaign, because we need cooperation with China for the planet, for the people. Like, how do you take everyone out of poverty? Shouldn't we learn that? Shouldn't we be cooperating? Shouldn't we be learning from each other? And as Janet Yellen knows, there's no decoupling from China without the US fully losing in that one. So one of the things I want to say about the new McCarthyism is it has real effects. And right now, because of what was said in that article in the New York Times, there are, just last week, 500 police spanned across cities in India, detaining 100 journalists and questioning them. And now there are 2 journalists in jail because it said they were taking money from the Chinese government, which the Indian government sees as an affront to the Indian government. And so these lies, these desperate lies, have real consequences, and they know that. But they're real consequences that stay silent. just like the loss of Palestinian lives remains silent to most Americans, it's all these lies do affect, as you said, Jeremy, the closing of schools. I mean, right now, all these lies and this hate also has many Chinese Americans returning to China, some generation, because of the violence. I mean, let's just talk about the violence against Chinese American, Asian Americans, because, you know, Americans can't tell the difference. But a recent study showed that 3/4 of Chinese Americans have experienced hate and violence in the last 12 months. That is horrific. And it does not stop the hate. It does not stop the lies. And yet we see constantly these innocent casualties with no change in behavior of the imperialist, colonizing, you know, violent government that's bullying the whole world. And the New York Times thinks it can bully those who stand for peace and justice and a value system that calls for equality for all.
Great. Thank you. That was wonderful. So, and we'll have time for questions for Jody after. So let's hear from another guest. So let's hear from our next speaker, Ben Norton, and then we'll move to the two speakers from Canada. So Ben Norton also has a lot of firsthand experience, and I believe now lives in China. So it'd be great to hear from him.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. This is a great event. It's very important. Thanks for organizing it. It's really important to emphasize that the new Cold War that the United States is waging on both China and Russia is ultimately aimed primarily at China. And it's easy to forget this because there is such a hysterical anti-Russian hatred in the United States. We see this in the media. We saw it with Russiagate. But if you carefully read documents prepared, for instance, by the Pentagon, the National Defense Strategy, or if you read NATO's strategic concept, if you read what internally these Western governments are saying, they all repeat the same line. In the short term, Russia is a so-called threat. But in the medium to the long term, China is the real threat because China poses a systemic alternative. Now, Russia is, of course, a very important country. Russia is one of the world's largest producers of oil and gas. It's also a leading producer of wheat and certain rare earth minerals. And certainly, Western governments would love to overthrow the Russian government. Joe Biden himself openly admitted this in a speech he gave in Poland. He said that the US's goal is regime change in the Kremlin, overthrowing President Vladimir Putin. And Western corporations would certainly love to privatize all of the very plentiful natural resources in Russia as they were privatized in the 1990s under neoliberal shock therapy. So I'm not in any way disputing the fact that Russia is being targeted in this very aggressive way. We can see that in this horrific proxy war in Ukraine, in which thousands of people have died. We don't even know the exact number. And NATO has been pushing Ukrainians into this meat grinder. And it's been very clear that they've been unable to take any territory. We were told that there would be this great counteroffensive that went nowhere. And, Ukrainians are dying on behalf of NATO. And, the line is that NATO is willing to fight until the last Ukrainian, and that's basically the situation we've gotten to at this point. But unfortunately, I don't want to sound pessimistic. I think, honestly, all of that is going to pale in comparison to the U.S. hybrid war against China. I mean, it's going to make Russiagate look like child's play because China actually does pose a systemic challenge to U.S. capital and to Washington's hegemonic domination of the entire world. And again, I'm not in any way disputing or downplaying the aggressive policy against Russia, but Russia systemically doesn't pose an alternative model or system. China absolutely does. And the reason I wanted to begin my remarks today emphasizing that is because when we're talking about McCarthyism, we have to understand what motivated McCarthy. And it was anti-communism specifically. And it was the threat that the Soviet Union posed to capitalism, and in particular to US imperialism, to the US economic domination of the world, especially when McCarthyism really began in the 1950s. This is, of course, at a time when Western Europe was still rebuilding after World War II. Their economies were destroyed. There were two very significant economies in the world, the US economy and the Soviet economy. And the Soviet Union had gone through a period of intense industrialization, massive economic growth. And many countries, especially the countries that were going through national liberation struggles in the global South, were not looking to the United States as a model for development. They were looking to the Soviet Union and state-led development. This is the peak of, socialism throughout the world. In fact, there was a period in the late 60s and 70s where 2/3 of the global population lived under socialist governments. And we saw that the Cold War, our first Cold War, was aimed at eradicating socialism anywhere it was through the use of armed force and violence, through genocide, through coups. So, of course, we know of the horrific borderline genocidal US wars on Vietnam and Korea, each of which killed around 3 million people. In the case of the Korean War, the US destroyed 80% of the buildings in the northern part of Korea, and US pilots came back with still many bombs they didn't drop, and they complained they didn't have anything left to bomb. And furthermore, of course, in Vietnam, we know very similar circumstances. Again, 3 million people killed. But what's less known is the genocide that the CIA sponsored in Indonesia, which was aimed at liquidating the Communist Party, which had been one of the largest communist parties in the world. In 1965 and 1966, between 1 and 3 million Indonesians were killed. Anyone who had a left-wing bone in their body was murdered, not only communists, but also labor organizers, teachers. Anyone who was progressive was accused of being a secret communist. And by the way, ethnic Chinese as well in Indonesia were targeted in this genocide because it was assumed that they were communists. And I mean, there are so many other examples. Of course, the dirty wars in South America, Plan Condor or Operation Condor, where the US backed coups to overthrow left-wing governments and installed right-wing dictatorships that murdered and disappeared and tortured and exiled countless leftists. I mean, this was a fascistic genocidal war against the left. And today the situation is not exactly the same, of course. There are many differences, but there's a thread of continuity, and that is that China poses a systemic threat. We need to stop echoing this propaganda from the United States that China is, that the conflict between the US and China is simply a political conflict, and China restored capitalism, and, China is state capitalist. No, China is developing its own unique form of socialism that many countries in the global South see as an alternative, once again, to Western neoliberal capitalism, just as at the peak of the national liberation and anti-colonial struggles in the 60s and 70s, many countries were looking first to the Soviet Union and then later to China to develop new models. You can go back and read Kwame Nkrumah, the founding father of Ghana, who was also overthrown in a CIA-backed coup. You can go back and look at many of the leaders of the anti-colonial national liberation struggles. And similarly today, China offers the possibility of another system. And I mean, you can look very clearly, the political economy of China is not that difficult to understand. The idea that it's the same as the West and it's a political conflict is ridiculous. In China, the banking sector is owned by the state and run on behalf of the people. The 4 largest banks in the world are Chinese banks, and they are state-owned banks, and they use lending in order to fund infrastructure development and to move the economy in a way that serves the interests of the people and also serves economic transition. So the Chinese government has lifted more than 800 million people out of poverty. I mean, if just adopting capitalism, which is the narrative we've been told, lifts 800 million people out of poverty, why hasn't India lifted 800 million people out of poverty? Why hasn't the Philippines? Why hasn't Honduras? I mean, why hasn't all of these countries? Haiti has been. I mean, the reality is, of course, there's also imperialism, but 800 million people lifted out of poverty, and furthermore, China right now, after overseeing some of the most incredible infrastructure development in human history, is now at an incredible speed transitioning its entire economy toward a green transition. And we have so many politicians in the United States, including basically the entire Republican Party, who refuse to acknowledge anthropogenic climate change, who are blatantly disregarding and denying climate science. And yet China is leading the entire world in the green transition. I mean, it's so funny to hear all these people in the US talk about the Green New Deal, which is a great idea. It's not happening in the US because the US political system is completely controlled by large corporations and financial interests. In China, there is an actual Green New Deal happening right now at an incredible speed. And you can see there's all this propaganda in the Western media claiming that the Chinese economy is on the verge of collapse, which is, you know, hysterical, ridiculous, hilarious projection for what's actually happening to Western economies, especially in Europe right now, which are being deindustrialized by their own policies, like sanctions against Russia and too much dependency on the United States. German industry is leaving at breakneck speed. Meanwhile, in China, the government is deflating the real estate bubble intentionally, and state-owned banks are directing lending into a massive boom in manufacturing of green technology. China already represents more than 80% of the world's investment in renewable energy resources, in particular in solar panels and electric vehicles. In 3 years, China has become the world's largest producer of cars. After it was the 6th largest producer, now it's the #1 producer in just 3 years. And it has overtaken Japan and Germany, which had been superpowers in car manufacturing. And China in particular is leading in the manufacturing of electric vehicles. I'm in Beijing right now. You can go out to the street and you can see constantly, every few minutes you see a car, or every few seconds you see an electric vehicle pass by. I mean, China is already going through this world historic transition that people in the US are debating about. It's actually happening right now as we speak, because the Chinese leadership can clearly see what direction the world is transitioning in, and they want to make sure that they are helping to lead that energy transition. So when you look at these policies, I mean, I haven't even mentioned telecommunications in China is all owned by the state and operated on behalf of the people, which is why, I mean, in the US, you pay what, $100 a month or an insane amount a month on your phone bill. In China, it's a few dollars a month because the telecommunications companies are owned by the state. This is a natural monopoly, and it's a public good. I mean, similarly for infrastructure, is state-owned and run on behalf of the people. 30% of GDP comes from state-owned companies, state-owned enterprises. So yes, it's not the same as the Soviet model, because they've decided that you don't need to have state planning and ownership of every element of the economy, like restaurants or very low scale manufacturing or clothing or things like that. But the commanding heights of the economy are owned by the state and run on behalf of the people. And we can now see that that means that China is able to embark on these very ambitious infrastructure development projects, where in the United States, it cannot even develop good quality high-speed rail. I mean, it's a joke. The public transportation in the US is absolutely a joke. The infrastructure is collapsing around people. Bridges are collapsing. And that's because the government is entirely controlled by large corporate and financial interests. It's a complete oligarchy. And this is true for both political parties. So the reason I emphasize all these points, and I'm going to wrap up here because I've gone over my time, I think. The reason I emphasize this is I think when we're talking about combating the new McCarthyism, we need to be able to understand what motivates this new McCarthyism. And this is the threat that China poses as a good example. The threat that it poses as saying that, yes, there is an alternative. The Margaret Thatcher quote that there is no alternative is absolutely ridiculous. There is an alternative. Many countries in the global south, which of course are actually the global majority, they represent 87% of the world population. They're not looking to the United States and the decadent neoliberal model as a way to develop their own economies. They're looking to China. And this also explains why there's so much interest in institutions like the BRICS. More than 40 countries have expressed interest in joining BRICS. BRICS is expanding. 6 countries have already been invited to join. So the new Cold War is fundamentally aimed at overthrowing the Chinese socialist model and the government and the Communist Party of China, reasserting U.S. imperial hegemony, and also reasserting capital and reasserting neoliberalism on the entire world, because the 1990s was the peak of neoliberal hegemony, not only of U.S. political dominance, but ideology is hegemonically reinforced by that political dominance. And this was the moment in which Francis Fukuyama and all these pseudo-intellectuals told the entire world there is no alternative, that neoliberal bourgeois democracy is the only form of human development that is possible. And there were many leaders, including in the global South, who internalized this idea. And increasingly, they can see that this is false. There are alternatives. So that is why the U.S. ruling class is so intent on destroying any alternatives. And that's why it's so important for people in the United States and in Canada and in Western Europe to push back against the hysterical anti-China propaganda, to talk about the many positive things that China is doing for the world, including leading the green transition, including lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, including supporting peace everywhere you look, from Ukraine to Israel, Palestine, to everywhere. I mean, China is a force for peace, where the U.S. is, objectively speaking, a force for war and instability. You cannot oppose the new McCarthyism while also going along with the anti-China propaganda. There are people who say, oh, of course, I'm not in any way, I'm not affiliated with China, and also China is bad. You can't, this is like the people who in the lead up to the Iraq war said, of course I oppose the Iraq war, but also Saddam Hussein is evil and likes to drink the blood of children. Or the people who claim to oppose the war in Syria, but they said, Assad is a horrific barbarian, and we need to oppose Assad, but we're also against the war. That's all you're doing is you're doing half of the work for the propagandists. In order to oppose the new McCarthyism, we also need to oppose the ridiculous anti-China propaganda. And that's why I congratulate people like Covert Action and the Canada Files and alternative media outlets for building this space to oppose the Western propaganda campaign against China, and to show that there is an alternative, and that in order to combat the new McCarthyism, we need to show what the alternative is, because ultimately, in order to oppose McCarthyism, we also have to have that fundamental political transformative change inside Canada and the United States itself. There needs to actually be a true left-wing movement that calls for people's power and opposes war and imperialism. So thanks for having me today.
Thanks. That was really great, Ben. Really gives us a great context for understanding both domestic and international developments. So thank you so much. And again, save your questions. We have two more speakers that will focus on the situation in Canada. Go ahead, Aidan.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, and thank you so much to everyone who's attended this event. I'm Aidan Jonah, Editor-in-Chief of the Canada Files. Before I get into anything else, I quickly just want to say that the intimidation of Chinese Canadians and other Canadians in Canada has been really a deep pattern, and it's really ramped up in the last, really ever since COVID's come along. It's just spiked up and up, but it's really gotten bad recently. Anyways, what me and Jeremy are going to be coming in to do, we're each going to be doing a fundraising message, myself for Canada Files, him for Covert Action Magazine. So I want to introduce to people Operation 135, and that is the Canada Files campaign to go from 65, we're actually up to 71 now, to 200 consistent financial supporters. So for the Canada Files, it's been nearly 4 years of groundbreaking investigations, insightful analysis, critical event coverage about Canadian foreign policy. We've given numerous contributors the space to speak their mind, backed up by evidence, and speak out against Canadian imperialism. Meanwhile, we've added Camila Escalante, editor of Custom News, who actually was actively involved in covering the resistance to the coup in Bolivia. She is now the host of the Canada Files Speakers Series. But I want to speak to you about the Canada Files investigation record. In the last year alone, it includes revealing how the Canadian consulate in Hong Kong retaliated against a Canadian expat for writing against Trudeau and doing ground-level reports on the situation in 2019 in Hong Kong. She's now left to survive in a stateless persons camp. We've revealed how the Canadian government and opposition MPs in our parliament willingly allow CIA-funded organizations, such as the Uyghur Rights Advocacy Project, to shape parliamentary subcommittee reports which have previously led to parliament votes. These groups actually have also advocated, funny enough, in favor of the Foreign Influence Registry when they're funded by the CIA. So people should really think about that when they're thinking about who's pushing for that registry in Canada that really is targeting China, Iran, Russia, and so forth. We've also revealed how the Canadian government funded a quote-unquote aid program working to set the table for mass privatization 2 years before the Maidan coup. And then we showed that Canada has given nearly 20 million to a project implementing ProZorro. It's a site to facilitate the selling of government and communal farming lands. We've also shown how university professors have been targeted for speaking out about the war in Ukraine and talking about Nazis in Ukraine. One of these students targeting a professor actually was on a Department of National Defense grant. We've also talked about the mass anti-communism in Canada. Nazigate, that is actually only one part of a 75+ year Canadian government policy to import anti-communists at every opportunity to suppress the Canadian working class, maintain colonialism and imperialism. We've revealed the Canadian oil company's extraction, pump and dump scam in Namibia. We've actually shown how Masih Alinejad, Canada's public broadcaster, has been protecting her by repeatedly concealing her US government-funded position whenever she appears. The Canadian government also, we showed, funded a Nazi propaganda bus tour in 2019, which I was actually subjected to in 2019. And it sought out an arsonist ex-Ukrainian government minister for an appearance. And then also, our media broadcasting regulator actually got pressured by the Canadian government into fast-tracking a broadcasting ban on RT. We showed how that happened. We got the documents. So the Canada Files, we've achieved a lot in our 4 years of existence, but we need more financial supporters to help our aim of becoming a sustainable journalism institution and continuing to do critical anti-imperialist journalism. When Canadian Parliament is honoring Nazis, while the broader West uses Nazis to attack their opposition and McCarthyism is sweeping the nation, journalism opposing Canadian imperialism is more needed than ever. So please consider helping us do this journalism by joining the 71 current consistent financial supporters. And that would be monthly or annual donations considered for the number. The link will be included below. So thank you so much for hearing me out, folks, and consider donating to support the Canada Files journalism. And really, thank you to the fantastic speakers so far. Brilliant insights.
Great. And yeah, while we wait for Eleanor, firstly, I can direct you to an article that I just published. I put it in the chat. Hopefully you can click on it. It's called U.S. Taxpayers Are Funding Their Own Conditioning. And it looks specifically at the role of the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a CIA cutout, in funding some of what we're discussing tonight, the anti-China propaganda, and the new McCarthyism. I mean, it's being funded directly by a U.S. government agency, the National Endowment for Democracy, which is an offshoot of the CIA that was founded in the 1980s, basically to promote propaganda directed against governments that the U.S. Fears, in the way that Ben Norton was describing China. And NED recently hosted this event. Beijing Rules is this book by a journalist, and it's really like kind of the old yellow peril journalism, and it warns. It relates to what Wenran Jiang was saying about this. Warns about this Chinese infiltration of America, and it can only point to one spy they may have uncovered. A woman was trying to sleep with some politicians. Was allegedly a spy, and they make it seem like there's this vast Chinese plot, to infiltrate the American government and to get classified, data from these politicians by sleeping with them. Although the book doesn't actually provide any evidence that any data was ever disclosed to this alleged Chinese spy, and it's only one possible spy. And actually, at the same when I attended that event, an online event with NED, and the same day, the New York Times, or that Sunday, the New York Times, they had a big, as biased as the newspaper is, I mean, sometimes they do some reporting that you can get some good information. They actually reported on this huge increase of the CIA operations in China, and that William Burns was actually bragging how the CIA has expanded its China operation and set up this big center. And because, a lot of CIA agents in China had been outed in the mid 2010s, and now the CIA is trying to rebuild its spy apparatus. So it's kind of ironic. They're warning about Chinese infiltration, and yet the New York Times is reporting how much the CIA has actually infiltrated China with a massive program to revitalize the Cold War. And I could put the link to another review I did of a book that looked at the early Cold War years when there were two American spies who were captured, Downey and Fecteau. They caught them because they were sending agents into China to try and foment unrest against the Chinese Communist government, and were carrying sabotage operations and basically a terrorist operation trying to foment a rebellion. So the U.S. and CIA have been trying to undermine the Chinese communist government since the 1949 Chinese Revolution, and the CIA is really devoted more and more resources to that. But they want the American and Canadian public to believe that China is the one threatening, innocent America or Canada and infiltrating, when evidence of that is very limited, and maybe a counter to the massive operations that the CIA, and I don't know about Canada's ties in these operations, but the CIA was reported on the front page of the New York Times, and Burns was bragging about it. So we're dealing with that. And I think, one thing we can do is help educate our friends, family, if we're teachers, about the double standards of U.S. foreign policy. And I'll make a brief pitch that, if you can help us out. I mean, those are the kind of story Covert Action magazine was historically devoted to exposing the CIA. It was founded by a CIA whistleblower named Philip Agee, who wrote a book called Inside the Company in 1975, exposing CIA operation, what he felt were criminal operations to carry out sabotage and undermine foreign governments and undermine democracy and support coups in Latin America especially, but also around the world, and an alignment often with fascist forces like we see today in Ukraine. So the magazine, is trying to carry on that legacy of Philip Agee of exposing the CIA criminality, and including new offshoots of the CIA like the NED, which are tied to the new McCarthyism. And it relates to what Ben is saying. They're investing a huge amount of money because of that threat of China. They've got to try and whip up public hysteria against China, and organizations like the NED are funding that, and they fund Chinese dissidents. Anyone who's against the Chinese government, like intellectuals, they may fund them to promote this anti-China message and to try and mobilize the public against China. So those are the kind of stories, we want to report on, help better inform the public. And with more revenue, we can do more reporting and expand our marketing and reach to try and build an opposition and better inform and educate the public, because education is an antidote to McCarthyism and its anti-intellectualism and bullying. So if you can chip in, if you can subscribe to our magazine for $25, that will give you a full subscription. If you're on a tight budget, if you can help us with just a small donation, even $5 or $10, every bit helps to advance our mission. So we may start with Eleanor Wong. Is she there?
Yeah, unfortunately. So here's the thing. Ellen is 74 years old, and this has happened before, where she would tell me to be at an indoor Starbucks. I would go to an indoor Starbucks, and she's at an outdoor Starbucks. Or that I'd go to find her not at the indoor Starbucks. I'd go to the outdoor Starbucks, and then she's not at that one either, and then she's at a McDonald's. So I've tried all three. I haven't found her. I think she's, and also it's very hard to get a hold of her because her phone is very old, so it takes a while for her to receive messages as well. And I just want to let you know that this is the kind of person that they thought it was appropriate to deny her passport for 5 years, keep her trapped in Hong Kong with no social services, no benefits, and just leave her out on the street where she is right now. So I'm just letting you know
Okay.
that
Well, hopefully you
that's
can
the
locate her.
brutality.
And we'll turn to Wenran Jiang, and then if you can't find her, maybe you can tell us a bit about her story. So first,
Yes,
though,
of
that'll
course.
give you some time to try and find her. So we'll shift to Wenran, and then we'll come back to you. So Wenran, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Jeremy, for the organizing this, and I appreciate your background information for our viewers and audience regarding the old McCarthyism, as well as how it manifests itself in its new form. And very much also appreciate both Jody and Ben, who give us passionate but very intelligent discussions regarding the new McCarthyism, how the China threat is being carried out in the political, sphere of the United States in this global geopolitical struggle. I guess for our purpose and the audience, I'm called to come in to tell a bit of a Canadian angle. I'm a retired political science professor from University of Alberta, and I can't really qualify myself as an activist. So let's just call me a retired political science professor who has specialized in East Asia for several decades, teaching and doing research. And my views are purely my own. I'm very much a concerned Canadian citizen. And I grew up in China when I was young, but I've left China some 40 years ago already. So that's a long time ago. I am a Canadian citizen, first generation Canadian citizen. I think the first question I would like to inform our audience, participants, either from the United States or if you're from Canada, it's what's going on. You may ask in today's subject area, do we really have something called a new McCarthyism going on in Canada's case against, say, China, or particularly Canadians of Chinese origin? I think Jody and Ben has made the case on what's happening in the United States. Probably people are less informed about the Canadian situation. So let me just go give my own personal assessment whether there's new McCarthyism going on in Canada against, say, Chinese Canadians. I would say yes. Why I'm saying that? As a political scientist, I would qualify what Jeremy had in the beginning extensively introduced to us about McCarthyism in two very simple areas in this political science distinction. One, it is a form of a political practice of publicizing accusations of disloyalty or subversion with insufficient regard to evidence. Okay, that's what McCarthyism is about in this political context. And number two is to use of the methods of investigation and accusation regarded as unfair in order to suppress opposition. I think on both accounts, it happens in Canada against Canadians of Chinese origin, and that is ongoing. Let me give you a number of examples. We have, since the beginning of the COVID lockdown, substantial increase in the crimes and discriminations against Asian populations. That's the case we know around the world in North America. And Vancouver and Toronto, one of the two largest cities in the world, has the most high concentration of Asian populations, especially Chinese. And we have numbers to back them down up. They have substantial increase in discrimination and anti-Asian crimes that in the past few years. This is actually coupled with a strategic shift of the US-led Western countries and the alliance, and the United States and Canada are the two closest NATO allies and the NAFTA partners. And therefore, as Jeremy mentioned, the younger Justin Trudeau, unlike his father, who broke with the West to establish diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China in 1970, in recent years, the Justin Trudeau has gone further towards the direction of coordinating with American global foreign policy agenda in dealing with China. Last fall, in Canada, we have an official release of an Indo-Pacific strategy. Notice the language here. Indo-Pacific has been coined only in recent years by the Americans to imply that somehow India or the other regions should be the center part to counter China. So therefore, the new language of calling the area, instead of Asia-Pacific, as we've known for decades, now is Indo-Pacific. So the Canadian Indo-Pacific strategy has not gone as far as calling China an enemy of Canada, but far enough to basically saying, qualifying China as a disruptive force. I'm not going to go into the details of that report. For example, what it means to be disruptive. Disruptive to what? To UN charter-based international order, or the so-called rule-based international order, which is another code language Canada adopted from the State Department of the United States. Therefore, the disruption is clearly against US-led rule-based model, less so of the UN charter-based international order, if you look at the Chinese foreign policy behavior. But it manifested domestically into a situation that more and more so China is being regarded as an enemy. Anybody who advocate engagement or peaceful means of dealing with China or advocating friendly relationships with China are being viewed publicly, accused of being the agent of the Chinese government, in the forms of saying someone in the government position or the MP of Chinese origin who are elected into the parliament accuse them of talking to the Toronto Consulate General of PRC. And or others, people say they have followed Chinese social media such as WeChat and therefore got brainwashed by the Chinese officials to vote in certain areas. And one conservative Chinese origin members of parliament was voted out in the last federal election in 1921. Without any evidence, the next day, he literally come out to say he was the victim of the Chinese interference of voting him out. No evidence. It's been a few years past, there's no evidence either. But this is manifested in the Canadian popular mainstream media, the National Post, the Globe and Mail, all running stories like this, global news, accusing Canadian MPs of Chinese origin of collaborating with the Chinese government. Okay, so this is actually ongoing. General Canadian populations of Chinese origin are being accused of either being knowing nothing, no independent judgment, being brainwashed by the Chinese government, or they're somehow consciously in collaboration with the Chinese government, working as their agent to interfere into Canadian elections of 2019 and 2021. So far, these leaks are by Canadian security intelligence service, CSIS, our equivalent of CIA in Canada. They are the body to provide internal research for government, yet they provide leakings to the press, totally illegal, and the press run them as they are. And these, none of them are being publicly disclosed, but the source is not disclosed. And the former Governor General, David Johnston, appointed by Justin Trudeau to look into this, and he came up with a report basically saying none of these accusations are true. They're false, especially one accusation against MP Han Dong from Toronto area of collaborating with the Chinese consulate general in Toronto. And he said that the accusations against him are false. And these are not accepted by the political opposition and the general media. And David Johnson, as appointed investigator, has to resign. So now we will need to have a public prosecutor or inquiry with a former judge to lead this. We're in the middle of this. So therefore, going back to wrap up my point one, new McCarthyism in the practice of accusation of citizens as disloyal to Canada is going on. And the message and accusing them is just unproven and unfair and is not transparent. The second point I want to say, which people wanted me to mention this, there's a petition called E4395. In the Canadian democracy, in our parliamentary system, citizens can organize petitions for or against something. So MP sponsored this petition, and we have a group of Canadian citizens sponsored it. I supported it. I was one of the many thousands who signed it. And this petition is basically questioning the validity of the government proposed foreign interference transparency registry. That's the name. They said we are not having enough methods, saying the lobby, Foreign Lobby Act, the election, act, and all that. We need more measures, and therefore they're proposing a foreign interference transparency registry. And in there, it's very, very difficult to classify who are the enemies or the hostile powers, because they're not simply in the government proposal, not defined. They're certainly not saying our allies, but who they're saying, they're not saying. But we all know who they're targeting at. Hostile powers, what do they mean? But the interesting part of this is, instead of trying to propose a foreign agency, foreign influence registry, it looks like more trying to regulate how its citizens should think. Let me give you an example. And the example is actually given by the government website as an interpretation paper saying why we need this registry. One of the so-called untransparent, non-transparent, or malign influence examples that the government gave is this, saying a Canadian academic talked to a foreign principal representing a foreign government, and he turned around, wrote an op-ed article in a major newspaper advocating an opinion that's sympathetic to that foreign country. And then he or she went back to the classroom, taught his or her students of the similar views. This is being presented as an example of the need for that academic to be registered as a foreign agent. I'm a retired academic and I'm appalled. We assume this academic has no independence. He or she cannot judge. If he or she talks to, say, consulate generals, diplomats from the French embassy, German embassy, Russian embassy, Indian embassy, Chinese embassy, and then he or she may not able to make a judgment call to write an independent op-ed piece, because he or she might have talked to a Chinese consulate general person. That person must have a method of poisoning his soul, and therefore the academic freedom is gone here. He or she, after talking to someone in the Chinese consulate cannot write an article, cannot be independent anymore. So these are the situations going on. And therefore, I basically signed it and saying we need to look into it more. I personally, and many people signed, are now saying we're against foreign influence. We're against the fight against foreign influence, let's put it that way. Foreign interference is a serious matter. We want to secure Canadian democracy, but we need to be transparent. The measure itself needs to be transparent. And that's the second point I want to say. And thirdly, and finally, I think I should wrap up and time is going on. There's an element in our today's discussion about how to fight back. The fight back to me is very simple. We need to look at Constitution in the United States, Charter of Rights in Canada. Some of these measures, the new McCarthyism and this manifestation in its current form is basically against the Charter of Rights in Canada. We cannot have the freedom of expression. That goes to a broader issue. I could go on to talk with Ban, who made an excellent case about China's case. I could go on with him for another couple of hours, but I'm trying to say is, in Canada, as conscious, autonomous citizens in a democratic society, we should be able to allow, under Charter of Rights, to think freely. We can think that somehow to engage and have better relations with China is to the best interest of Canada. I think we should be able to be allowed to think and say so, not to be accused of being a Chinese government agency or somehow lobbying on behalf of the Chinese government. Nor should we be accused of somehow, if we vote in a certain way, somehow we must be manipulated. So the danger here is this: the authorities, the ones who are in charge, who wants to control how you think. They want the Canadians of Chinese origin or the Chinese Americans here and there around the world, divide them into good Chinese citizens of American or Canadian citizenry. If you're against China today, you're good buddies. If you're advocating friendly relationship with China, you're somehow classified as bad Canadians or bad Chinese Americans, and you should be probably watched. And the spy agencies of the Five Eyes are illegally monitoring all of the citizens in different ways. If CSIS legally cannot monitor the Canadian citizens, of course, the CIA could do that on their behalf and pass the information through the Five Eyes network. These things happened, which is a threat to Canadian democracy, and we need to think about it very, very seriously, and we need to advocate our rights. It doesn't have to be a hyperactive people. Ordinary citizens are basically saying, I just wanted to exercise my Charter of Rights and think and vote freely without being accused of some kind of a foreign agency or foreign spies, as we're seeing in the wave of the new McCarthyism. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We really appreciate that analysis and insights into what's going on in Canada. And now we're going to, Aidan Jonah from the Canada Files is going to come on for a minute as we wait for Eleanor.
Can I say goodbye? Just because it said we were ending in an hour, so I have my next to jump into.
Well, thank you for joining us.
I just want to say that I'm going to put in the chat ways that you can engage. Make sure to sign on to the New McCarthyism campaign. And I did write an op-ed to the New York Times in response to what they did to us at Code Pink. And also there's a lot of information in the Solidarity link of articles written about this issue. But I think that, we need to look at how many lives over the last, 70 years have been taken because the word communism could be used that is then therefore you're not human. And the dehumanizing of people over communism, something that is about the love of humanity, is at the root cause of this problem. And it's at the root of the violence that is the oppressive, colonializing, violent power that is the United States of America. And there was a question about the left, and I was like, it's not that the left is anti-communist. The left is anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist. It's the anti-war. It's like if I want to say that this campaign, the new McCarthyism campaign, has united the left in a way that the Ukraine war separated it. That there is a deep understanding of the violence of the new McCarthyism that isn't so new, has a long tail and has been ever present. But as Ben said, China has really reawakened it because it is an alternative, and it is a beautiful alternative, a place where women can feel safe, a place where 90% of the people own a home. That level of an alternative is an existential threat to the empire that has been, destructive to the rest of the world, including the planet. So I'm sorry I have to leave. Thank you for including me. So awesome to see you, Ben and Varen, and thanks everyone for your voices and your activism. And I say to end, it's up to all of us to have the courage to tell the truth. For us, it's to not be silenced and to be in rooms where we are willing to say China, where we're willing to tell the truth, and understanding that the consequences of that truth is really a liberation of the minds that are in the room that we're speaking in. So thank you and good night.
So thanks for being here. And yeah, is Eleanor available? Or if not, maybe you can help us tell her story.
She's not available, so
Okay.
I'm going to have to talk
Okay.
and explain her situation. I would just like to mention, in light of the current events that are happening today, and the shameless racism of the media, in how they can just make an accusation against a certain political formation without any proof. Like, I haven't seen any proof of any mass rape or organized race on the part of Hamas, but they just say that they do it. And because America's troops do it, obviously Hamas is out to do it, but I haven't seen any proof of that. Anyways, to those that are fighting for their lives in Palestine, I wish you the best, inshallah, that you continue to humiliate the Israeli government and motivate the anti-colonial progressive Muslim countries in the region to bring an end to that colonial project. Now, when we look at Eleanor's situation, like, basically it all started, like, the racism towards her from the consulate actually started in 2016, but then the political persecution started in 2018. So you could see a 2-year passport, which is very unusual for most Canadians. If you're Canadian and you notice that she was given a 2-year passport just because she took on an Asian last name, that's unheard of. You can't even apply for a 2-year passport. So she was given that first off from February 2016 to 2018. Then on February 2018, because she was trying to promote her 3 books. So the first book, Justin Trudeau, America in Danger. The second one was it was Jihadi Justin, and then the third one was Fake Male Feminism. Now, because she was promoting these 3 books on social media, they had asked her to give them proof of her Hong Kong identification, even though she had a visa in mainland China. So she had a visa in mainland China. She wouldn't have had a Hong Kong ID, but they were asking for proof of that. And that's not a requirement to get a passport extended or passport renewed. So they were asking her for that. She didn't have it, of course, so she had to wait a little bit. April, they published the books. They refused to give her a passport. August, her visa expires. So her visa expires in August 2018. Then she's brought before the court in November 2018. So she's brought before the court in November 2018. They say it's only been 4 months, and we're going to give an order to the Canadian consulate to do her passport right away. January 2019, she goes over, she tries to get it, and the pretext they give her is, oh, we don't have your birth certificate. Now, we don't need a birth certificate. I don't even have a birth certificate. I was born in Rwanda during the Civil War from 1990 to 1994. The hospital was burned down. I don't have a birth certificate, and I have a valid passport. So how does that make sense? So finally, they admit that she's supposed to get a passport. She pays for one May 2018. So she pays for the passport May 2018. May 2019. Sorry, May 2019. They screw around, mess with her, up until November 2019. They tell her to go get her passport at the immigration detention center. So this is what they wanted to do. They wanted to go to an immigration detention center where they're still doing vaginal and anal searches in the Hong Kong prisons. So this is what the Canadian government tried to do to what was a 70-year-old woman at the time. She is 74 years old now. So these constitution, this right, this charter, it's just a piece of paper. What you have to do is obey the line in the position of the ruling class of the country. And what national interest is a fundamentally different understanding for a socialist state than it is for a capitalist state. So national interest will serve the interest of the majority of the people in the country in a socialist state or even in a planned economy, because the capitalists are not dominant in that country, and because the ones that are ultimately making decisions about what to do with resources are the majority of the population through vote. So they vote on how the resources are allocated. That's how the system works. In China, in Vietnam, in Cuba, that's how the system works. In a capitalist country, the ruling class has a hold and dominance over the economy, and then they pay and bribe political officials to implement policies in the way that they want. So the national interest is what serves that tiny little majority that rules all of the politicians. So that's a fundamental difference between national interest of a country like Canada, which is a colonial capitalist state, and the natural interests of China. And one of the reasons I think why it's easier for the left to unite against the McCarthyism against Chinese Americans and China is because China is not attacked Taiwan yet. I'm sure that when China is backed into a corner and forced to attack Taiwan, there's going to be a different outlook, a different perspective. But when Russia attacked Ukraine, that's when the friction and division started among the left, and I even got the brunt of that, and I got punished for it in my own party when I was a Communist Party member in Canada. Of course, I got punished for it directly by losing a job in Canada and going through a lot of things where I had to leave. I was about to get assassinated by the Rwandans with Canada enabling the situation. So this is the truth. I want people to, not have any more illusions. This is what's actually happening. They are torturing a 74-year-old woman, Eleanor Wan. They're torturing her. They are denying her services, denying her social services, and leaving her out here. The only choice she has really right now is to apply for non-refoulement in Hong Kong. And because she's in Hong Kong, she won't be able to get official refugee status because it's a different jurisdiction. And their understanding of the law is they don't have to treat her as an official refugee. They just give her non-refoulement. Basically, she can't be deported. So if she applies for that, maybe she gets a little bit of token funding or whatever, and maybe stays in a small hotel until she dies. So that's her choice right now. This is what they've done to her because she wrote 3 books, kind of exposing a lot of things about the Trudeau family. And inshallah, she gets motivation and she writes a bit more. She's also going to talk about how the persecution actually didn't even just start 2018. It's been longer. So she's her father was part of a peace movement because he fought alongside the Soviets in World War II as a Canadian, and he advocated for peace with the Soviet Union and peace with China. They made a file on it, and inshallah, when she gets the opportunity to finish that writing, she's going to talk about that. They made a file on him, and then they made a file on her because she followed in her father's footsteps. She has a little bit of a more conservative outlook. She's old. She has 74-year-old views, but she's basically been a pacifist all her life, and this is what they've done. Well, pacifist. So I'm just letting all of you know that this myth that you have. Please read an article that I had, Canadian Government Foreign Interference Paranoia Ends Universal Free Speech Myth, on the Canada Files. There are a lot of articles on this, but that one kind of ends up showing what the strategy is. So they're going to have a flexible interpretation of laws in all NATO countries, a flexible interpretation that is going to serve their interests. And they even project on their own strategies and tactics that they use to bully other countries and threaten other countries diplomatically. When they're talking about China and they talk about US and all of these other things. So as a reporter here who has actually been targeted by the Canadian government and who's witnessed a 74-year-old woman being tortured by the Canadian government, I want people to, wake up and see that it's going to get a lot worse if you don't wake up and if you don't act with serious urgency.
Great. Well, thank you. At least, yeah, we get it'd be nice to meet Eleanor, but we get a good sense from you of her story and the persecution she's experienced and this travesty of justice that we're seeing increasingly. So let's open it now to the audience. We can stay on as long as some people want, I guess. I may have to leave soon, but let's open it up for questions. So I don't know. I guess people could just speak up. Okay, I see LM Carter has raised his hand, so go ahead. If you're there, unmute and ask your question.
Okay, it's me. Just real quick. I asked Mr. Norton a question in the chat. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Because I was concerned the cobalt, excuse me, cobalt is poisonous. And actually they have children who are actually rinsing off cobalt. You know, I'm making it simple. And so I know that, as he was saying, the Chinese are leading in terms of the green economy, but I know unless they're doing something different, the electric cars in the United States and cell phones and computers require this mineral that is really having a toll on people in the Congo, probably other places, but I know about the Congo. And I was just wondering, in light of his analysis of China, and I agree with everything he said, I was quite impressed with him because he was talking like somebody who actually lived through that period. You know, just, you know, the Chinese relationship to Africa, because I'm hearing things like the Chinese are buying up hectares of land, that at first they were building infrastructure or helping the African countries build infrastructure, which made the United States really nervous because the United States, when they go in, or Europeans go in, they don't necessarily leave anything, they destroy stuff. So the Chinese style is, you know, much different. But now I understand that they're bringing Chinese workers into the African countries to do the work now, which means it may be putting, you know, potential employees, I guess, for lack of another term, in the job market. It may, you know, replace Africans who are Africans with Chinese workers. So that's why I want to ask him, since he was in China, if he knew anything about that.
Yeah, thanks for the great question. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of propaganda about China, in particular in Africa, and it's incredible to see Western colonial powers that colonized Africa accusing China of doing exactly what they did, which is absurd. I mean, of course, France committed genocide, Belgium committed genocide in the Congo, and you know, the Dutch and basically every European power in 1884, they met the Berlin Congress and they divided up Africa quite literally on a map and decided which country would colonize which area. So, I mean, it's incredible projection, once again, of what Western governments have been and continue to do to Africa. And we've seen now, especially in West Africa, in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, huge rebellions against French neocolonialism. Let's not forget that France still controls the currency of a dozen Western and Central African nations that are part of the CFA franc zone, including Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali. They don't have monetary sovereignty, and that also means that half of the foreign exchange reserves of their central banks has to be held in Paris, and they have no control. They cannot implement monetary policy, which means it's impossible to introduce any kind of significant industrial policy. It makes it very difficult to fund social programs. It makes it impossible for them to make their exports competitive because they can't, you know, they can't devalue their currency to make their exports more competitive. So, I mean, France still controls the economies of many of these countries. But in terms of your question immediately, I mean, what China does is China always takes a handoff approach to governments. It does not meddle in their internal affairs. Now, usually that's almost always a good thing, right? Because the Western powers are constantly intervening and meddling in internal politics and elections and imposing political conditionalities. Now, in the case of China, what that also means is that even if there's a government in an African nation or in Latin America that, you know, is a pretty awful government, China still is hands off. They say, we simply want to do business with you. We want to engage in what they refer to as win-win cooperation. We can help you develop an infrastructure project, and there are multiple ways that you can pay. You can pay through, you know, a loan over time, or they can work out these kind of barter deals. So, for instance, China and Iran have worked out an agreement where China is helping to modernize and expand the main international airport in Tehran, and in return, Iran is basically just paying with oil. And China is also helping with Bolivia to expand its lithium production. And again, it's in return for access to lithium. I mean, you have to ask, like, a lot of these governments, I mean, they need assistance because, you know, mining, and not just mining, but industrial development is very complicated. You need a lot of skilled engineers. You need a lot of actual capital investment. You need machine parts. You need advanced technology. And a lot of these countries don't have access to any of this. And if you look consistently, countries like Bolivia, for instance, they have consistently relied on support from China and Russia rather than Western corporations. So, I mean, this idea that it's like neo-colonial is ridiculous because it's these governments, these sovereign governments that are deciding to work with Chinese firms, not, you know, that are being forced by China to do that. So in the case of mining practices in Africa, I mean, absolutely, there are a lot of horrible conditions. You know, you mentioned Congo, but in many other countries, there are accusations in Zambia as well. And, you know, the thing is that China is not doing that. I mean, what China does is it makes agreements with these countries, and it's ultimately it's an issue of the countries that, you know, their governments. Now, people could say that maybe China should export revolution like the Soviet Union did, but then they would be accused of intervening in the internal affairs of countries, you know, internal politics. So it's a complicated situation, but the reality is that China does not impose these agreements on countries. These agreements are looking for assistance. And in the case of Chinese workers, this is a myth that's been debunked. There's actually a very mainstream scholar who, very surprisingly, is actually quite good and impartial, named Deborah Brautigam, who is a scholar at Johns Hopkins University. And there's a center there, which is the Center for Chinese African Studies, something like that. And she has done a lot of research on this. And again, this is a very mainstream US scholar. And she has said very clearly the idea that, you know, China is exploiting Africa in this colonial way is completely false. It's a complete myth that these are bilateral, mutually beneficial agreements that are done consensually by different governments in Africa with Chinese firms. She also pointed out, by the way, that the whole idea of debt trap diplomacy is a complete myth. And it was surprising, but even the Atlantic magazine, which is just a rag, a mouthpiece for US foreign policy, even they published an article that she wrote in which she showed how the myth of debt trap diplomacy, and pointed out that China has in fact pardoned the debt of dozens of African nations, and also China has been willing to renegotiate debt in a way that the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank never have done. They never forgive debt, and they're very strict in renegotiating. And once again, they impose political conditionalities. The IMF and the World Bank tell you, you have to privatize your health sector, you have to privatize education, you have to drop the minimum wage, you have to open your capital markets, lift capital controls, deregulate industries, you have to reduce all controls on your currency to make it freely floating, which means that overnight your people lose half of their purchasing power. China doesn't do any of that. Usually that's a good thing. But again, I mean, some of these governments are not great governments, but China doesn't want to impose its will on them. The last thing that I'll say is if you look at leftist parties in Africa, they're all very pro-China. I would especially recommend people to check out the Socialist Party of Zambia. Zambia is now taking another massive IMF bailout, which includes neoliberal structural adjustment. The Socialist Party of Zambia is in the opposition right now, and they have been heavily criticizing this and calling for more cooperation with China. So I would check out some of the Socialist Party of Zambia, and they have a lot of good articles and speeches talking about this.
Ben, real quick, I just want to ask real quick regarding Barack Obama's presidency and China, because somehow I suspect that the reason for his presidency had a lot to do with China being in Africa. And the only way that they could, I'm sorry, they couldn't have a Bush administration under the circumstances. And since President Obama had connections, you know, in terms of his heritage, it made it a good way or justified the AFRICOM.
Yeah, and this is a good point. In fact, it was the Obama administration that started the so-called pivot to Asia, which really means pivot to war on China. It was the US Defense Department decided they're going to start moving resources from West Asia, from the so-called Middle East, and focus on moving those resources, including warships and missiles, to East Asia, to the Pacific region. They've now, you know, rebranded the Indo-Pacific. And right now, in fact, the Pentagon, I should have mentioned this earlier, the Pentagon is spending tens of billions of dollars developing an offensive missile system on the so-called First Island chain, which are the series of islands. They're called the First Island chain because they're the series of islands that are the first islands off of mainland China. And this includes the Philippines is opening 4 new U.S. military bases. And again, these are offensive missile systems aimed at China. But this all goes back to the Obama administration and especially the Hillary Clinton State Department in Obama's first term. And you mentioned that AFRICOM drastically expanded its presence. And by the way, the most expensive U.S. air base outside of the United States is in Niger. And this has become a hot point of debate because, you know, there's a new nationalist military government in Niger that has kicked out French forces. And the question is if they're also going to kick out U.S. forces. And the U.S. military uses this massive drone base in Niger, right in the middle of the Sahel, in order to spy on northern and central Africa. So you're absolutely right. I mean, the Obama administration played a very important role, not only in militarizing the African continent, but also in really kickstarting the new Cold War on China. Although one final point I'll mention is that if you go back and you read the foundational documents of the Project for the New American Century, who were the neoconservative forces that really populated the Bush administration, Bush Jr., and they were some of the architects of the Iraq War, people like John Bolton, who were brought back later under Trump. If you read back and you go to the 90s and the early 2000s, the Project for the New American Century also emphasized that they wanted regime change in China as well. So it's not necessarily new that started immediately under Obama. There were a lot of neoconservatives in Washington who were calling for this under the Bush administration as well, but especially under Obama, of course, with the war in Libya, the destruction of Libya, the destabilization of Northern Africa, that really unleashed the floodgates for the aggressive campaign we're seeing today.
Thank you.
Thanks for a great answer. Well, we have a number of questions. I see Yuri Smuder as one. I don't know if you can step up.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. This has been a fantastic web event. So thank you to all the panelists and the organizers. I have 2 very quick questions, both to you, Jeremy, and to Ben, which is, you know, given that it's Thanksgiving Day in Canada and it was Columbus Day or celebrate the first Génocidaire in the U.S. Day, so I wanted to ask you both, what do you think it's going to take for the anti-imperialist movement, the workers' right movement, the Black left, the Latino left, feminists, eco-justice groups, the queer left, and just the broad people power movements in the U.S. to show more urgent solidarity to the plight of Native Americans, Indigenous Hawaiians, and Indigenous Alaskans? And do you both think that it's time that the global left, particularly the Western left, move beyond its anti-communist leftism? We've been having a lot of talks about anti-communist leftists, so curious your response to both of those questions. Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, yeah, I think we see, you know, the legacy. I saw another question related to the original McCarthyism, and in a way, the weakness of the left today is a consequence of the destruction of the left in the 1950s, 1960s, under, you know, a program like COINTELPRO. I mean, the left is very focused today, you know, what defined as left on identity politics, very fragmented, often single issue. You don't really find a large scale anti-imperialist left. You don't find a huge commitment to socialist economic program. Hopefully we may see, you know, a shift in consciousness, or, I mean, the economic situation that I think Ben, you know, was mentioning that, I mean, the economic, you know, vitality of the world is now in the East and China, and our economies are stagnating, and young people are really suffering from debt, you know, student loans, and terrible job market and terrible public transportation and healthcare and education. So hopefully, we might see a revitalization of a socialist movement. I mean, a lot of young people are open to the idea. They don't see socialism as a negative word like their parents. So that stigma may be slowly eroding, and that would bring hope for a revitalized socialist, anti-imperialist left. But the left has been ravaged for decades now and fragmented and weak. And we see this, I mean, wars like Ukraine, a lot of so-called people on the left allied behind it, at least for a time period. So a lot of the left-wing politicians that they followed, like a Bernie Sanders, as Jody was describing, she was at his office yesterday because he voted for those billions into Ukraine, and they were trying to knock some sense into him. So Bernie, defined the left for some people, and look what he was supporting. So I think it's a bleak situation, but there's hope maybe for regeneration.
All right, thank you, Jeremy, so much for that answer. I actually want to come in with a question for the two, Canadian panelists.
Okay.
So for one round, my mistake, and of course Hartad. So with the more so for one round, with Chinese, Canadians, of course, there is frankly very serious intimidation, and this atmosphere really hampers the ability of Chinese Canadians to exercise their democratic rights and to feel safe in, say, speaking positively about China, or even just having relations with China, be going to China, generally having basic engagement. So I'm wondering how you think what Canadians should and can do to make Chinese Canadians feel more safe in exercising their democratic rights and feeling safe to speak out against policies they may oppose.
All right. Okay, Jeremy, I'll jump in with that if you're okay. Thanks, Aidan. As I mentioned earlier, I think if you have an assessment of the current state of affairs in Canada regarding both Canada-China relations, as well as the treatment of Chinese Canadians in general, there are reasons to be concerned. The idea that somehow the Canadian state at the current form under the Liberal minority government of Justin Trudeau somehow has a deteriorating relationship with China, and therefore everybody, its citizenry, should be on board to treat China as a hostile power. Any deviation or dissent voices from that position is being considered disloyal to the Canadian state or less worthy of being a true Canadian citizen, especially for those who are new immigrants from the Chinese mainland. I think it's very problematic, that position. I'm not speaking, I myself is a first generation Canadian and with the Chinese mainland background. I could tell you that the Chinese community is very diversified. There are people who actually have very divergent views. There are people who are saying, well, they can do any foreign registry laws they want. It's nothing to do with me. I have nothing to hide. I'm glad to do my middle class life in Canada. I have a job, secured healthcare, I have family. The problem is that a divided Canadian public opinion, even among Chinese Canadians, are fine. As long as in a democratic society, we actually allow different voices to coexist. I'm not here, nor do I know any of the many other people I know of the Chinese community, people in Canada or anywhere else are trying to impose some kind of a unified voice. People have different opinions. They express them. That's actually the essence of a democratic society. And the question and the problem of new McCarthyism and its expression as it is going on in Canada and somewhere else especially in the United States, is that somehow you cannot express different voices than what the government wants you to think about. And that is a problem. It reminds me of 1960s China during the Cultural Revolution. Somehow there's only one voice, there's only one party, there's only one truth. We have, and we should know better, that shouldn't be the case in a democratic society like Canada. So to go back to the question specifically, how do we deal with the situation? I think the Canadians need to be aware that you need to be proactive in many ways to say the current state of affairs of freedom and freedom of expression that we have in the Canadian society, and to a certain extent in all democratic societies, is not something given or granted. It's a constant struggle, and you have to fight for it. You have to sustain it. Today, actually this year, 2023, many people may not even know outside of Canada, it's a 100-year anniversary of the Canadian Parliament passing a Chinese Exclusion Act, normally referred to as the Chinese head tax, back in 1923. I mean, it took many years in 1947 to get it abolished. That's actually the only, so to speak, ethnic community, race in the Canadian history to be excluded, forbidden to be coming to Canada. But even it was abolished in 1947, guess what? That racist, unjust parliamentary legislation implemented against Chinese Canadians and Chinese people did not get a parliamentary apology until 2006. Until 2006, when during the federal election of that year, tight election, somehow in Toronto and Greater Toronto and Greater Vancouver area, Chinese Canadians' vote became obviously a force to reckon with. So therefore, all the federal parties began to compete with each other, saying, if I'm elected, I will apologize in the parliament for the Chinese head tax. And eventually, the elected minority government leader, Stephen Harper, for the first time to be elected from actually where I am, Alberta, Canada, apologized officially, that is, for the head tax. So therefore, my point is, we need to be conscious that history may repeat itself if we do not hold up what we should hold up, the basic rights and Charter of Rights, in this case, in Canada. Thank you.
Hey there, everyone, and everyone else. Thank you very much for listening along so far. We're actually going to give one more person the chance to ask a question, and then we're going to put this event to a close. So I'm now going to elevate Bernie Holland to have the chance to ask the question. They should be able to now. Okay, Bernie, did you have a chance to answer your question? Just ask.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Great. Thanks. I'll just get my video up for you so you can see me. Right. Well, first of all, I just want to just thank Jeremy, my friend Jeremy. This is the best webinar I've been on. I've been on a number of webinars. All right. And this is the best one I've been on. It's amazing. All of you, all your and I'm in London. It's 3 o'clock in the morning here in London. All right. You've kept me up all night. But it's wonderful to hear everything. Now, I've got a question about, it's about the way these countries are forced into taking out loans, and they get, I think it's some of the, is it like investor state dispute settlements or something? I'm not sure what it is, but and if they decide they don't want to try and get out of this situation, you know, whereby their resources are being it's another colonial thing, isn't it? They're stealing their resources. Do you know what I'm talking about? I'm not expressing this very clearly.
You're talking about like if they don't want to take the World Bank loan or the IMF
Yeah,
loan,
that's
which
the
is a
one, Mark.
condition of structural adjustment program.
That's the one. Yeah. Can you talk about that? Because how can we get around this stuff? Because I mean, these people are being ripped off. You know, whole countries are being put in debt traps, and it's just not right. You know.
Well,
What's your view on
so
it?
like countries that don't want to take the IMF, World Bank loans, or that aren't even offered the loans, like Iran or Eritrea, you see what happens when Eritrea refuses the loan.
Yeah.
So they get sanctions, they get put in the margins, they
Yeah.
get told, this is a brutal dictatorship, and then as a result of that, Canada sanctions them, the U.S. sanctions them, all of NATO sanctions them, and they're cut off from that particular part of the world's market. So obviously the solution is what is BRICS. The solution is the Asian Bank. The solution is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Those it.
Are you talking about Dilma Rousseff and the National Development Bank in China?
Yeah. Basically,
yeah,
that
alternative
system,
yeah.
that whole alternative system, that whole alternative payment system, and de-dollarization, because it's the petrodollar that they use as leverage to to force people into accepting these loans, accepting the privatization, and accepting. So if that's basically the system as it is and as it's run. And it's going to end up having to cause more chaos in the NATO countries, and they having to get weaker. So that's why they're in desperation trying to hold on to Ukraine.
Right.
Because they have to find a way to weaken that part of the multipolar push. And So that's the truth.
That's the reason why you talked, Martha. You talked about the petrodollar. All right, as forcing the petrodollar. That was the reason why they assassinated Gaddafi, wasn't it? Because he wanted to use the dinar as a currency for the new African alliance he was trying to get together. Is that right?
Yes. I mean, it was that. It's also the fact that he had a socialist country. It was his own brand of socialism. And he was very hostile towards the whole imperialist movement. So those are the main reasons.
Right.
He never should have gotten rid of the nukes and the strategic weapons, but he did.
Well, he gave a speech at the United Nations 2 years earlier. Do you remember? In 2009, he gave a keynote speech at the United Nations and embarrassed them all. You know, I've got a transcription of it, the whole thing.
I'm very sorry to jump in there,
anyway,
Bernie.
Aidan, thank you for allowing thank you very much for allowing me to speak. And
no worries. Your insights, your opinion, your question was appreciated.
Thank you very much. Yeah, great.
Thanks. I just wanted to jump in simply because Jeremy Kuzmarov, the co-host, he had needed to head on out. Ben Norton has needed to head out as well. Wenran has also the need to head out. So I viewed it best as the now host of the event to make the decision to head towards this event's end. So we can end with the maximum number of our fantastic, insightful speakers. So just to remind folks that this event was all about the new McCarthyism in Canada and the US and what we can do to fight it. We had brilliant speakers. We had from Code Pink, we had Code Pink's co-founder. We had Wenran Jiang. We had Martad Umukiaba, who stood up in place of Eleanor Wong. and of course, yes, Ben Norton. So, folks, thank you very much for taking the time to attend. Just want to give the speakers one last chance just to maybe take 30 seconds, say what they'd like, and then that'll be the very end of things.
Okay, Jeremy, Aiden, sorry. I'm jumping in just to say I got to go for another call with China due to time difference. I enjoyed the seminar and the panelists and the questions. I would love to have time to talk more. Back to our earlier question regarding the Chinese labor in Africa, I just want to compliment Ben's response that, in fact, I've done many years of field research in Africa, including multiple trips to Congo. And I published an article in 2009 in the China Quarterly about the Chinese investment practices in Africa. And that was one of the earlier academic reviewed articles, is still being quoted many years later. And there's a negotiated portion, just want to update you that between the Chinese enterprises, the increasing Belt and Road initiatives in Africa and the local governments. They work out a deal with local conditions. They limit the Chinese labor and technicians to a certain smaller percentage to ensure the maximum employment will come to local populations. And they're going through the learned curve and adjustment. That's where it's going on with China's investment in Africa. Regarding other issues, that's a little bit off the topic from the new McCarthyism. I would love to read all the links that you posted. I want to thank you for everyone for having me. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Wenron. All right, so Marta, why don't you give your quick thoughts, and we're gonna head right to the end.
All right, so I'll just lay out my honest opinion on the whole universal free rights thing. I don't believe in it at all. It is not a thing that I believe in. But if you believe in it, and you really think it can be saved in the democratic, great democracies of NATO, where were you when Russians were getting sanctions for supporting a certain position on the war? Where were you when a charity was being sanctioned for allegedly supporting Hamas? Where were you speaking up for the free speech and the free rights then? You have to be consistent. If you believe it's universal, and if you're going to have a universal stand up for those rights and to hold on to those rights, you have to be consistent. You can't be quiet when it's happening to one section and when it's happening to a smaller section that you're not interested in. And also, you have to work with other people. If you're going to hold on to one principle, hold on to one thing, you can't expect everybody to believe the same thing or have the same views on everything. So that's my suggestion to people who want to rally around particular ideas or believe in a universal idea and want to fight for it.
All right, Marta, thank you very much. And one more time, thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to those folks who asked the questions in the Q&A. It was much appreciated. So, on behalf of the Canada Files and Covert Action Magazine, who are the co-hosting groups of this event, and Sami Doon, who was the lead sponsor, we offer our deepest thanks for their assistance with the event and the registration process. And yet again, we thank everyone who has attended this event. This will be the end of the webinar. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to come along here, and have a fantastic night or day if you're out, say, in China. Goodbye, folks.